Ferry Road. Take the slip road ahead. Recalculating.
Excuse me, could you tell me the way?
So how do you feel when you're lost? Do you feel scared? Do you feel confused? Do you feel fed up? Do you feel angry? Do you just want to sit down and just give up? There's so many tools that we can employ when we're in that situation. We can use a sat-nav, we could use a map, we could use Google Maps on our phone, we could use good old-fashioned signposts, we could even ask directions. We're going to look today at how God guides us, the light of guidance, and we're going to use the story of Moses and the exodus of the people from Egypt. And it's an amazing story. It's full of missions, it's full of plagues, it's full of action, it's full of battles. And we're going to go right back to the beginning and just set the scene of what this story is all about. And we're going to be looking in Exodus, and I'm going to paraphrase, you'll be pleased to know, Exodus 1 to 14, which is the story of Moses. So at this point, the Israelites had been living in Egypt for 430 years, and a new king had come to power. And he began to get worried about the number of Israelites that were in Egypt and the strength of them. And he was concerned that if Egypt went to war, the Israelites would rise up against them, side with their enemies, and they would be defeated. So he took it upon himself to try and crush the Israelite people. He wanted to do everything he could to reduce their strength. And he basically enslaved them. He made them work in really difficult, harsh conditions. He ordered all of the baby boys to be killed. And those of you that know the story will know that this is where Moses came into it. He was born and his mum couldn't bear the thought of him being killed, so she hid him in the bulrushes. And he was rescued, and he actually ended up living in the palace. This is the sat-nav moment 1. Okay, this is where the first sat-nav moment happens. Moses grew up, and then for various reasons he spent some time in exile. He had to run away, and he spent part of it hiding down a well. He'd killed an Egyptian, and he basically had to make himself scarce. So one day he was out looking after the sheep, and he was just minding his own business and minding the sheep, and he spotted in the distance a bush that was on fire. But this just wasn't any old bush on fire. It was on fire, but it wasn't burning up. So he went to investigate, and that's when God spoke to him. God said that he could see the misery and the pain that the Israelite people were suffering, and that he was going to rescue them so that they could live in the promised land. And then he gave very clear instructions about what Moses had to do. Moses was a little bit concerned about these instructions and felt that if he went back to the elders of the tribes with these instructions, they probably wouldn't believe him. They'd think he was a bit of a crackpot. So God gave him some signs that he could use to prove that it was God that had spoken. Turned his staff into a snake and back again. He made his hand diseased and back again, and said that he could use these signs as proof. Moses tried again to get out of it. I don't speak very well. I can't speak. I'm just not the person you want for this job. But God had an answer for that as well. So he sent him along with his brother Aaron, who would speak for him. So off they go to Egypt, and I think at this point it must have felt a little bit like a sat-nav fail. It must have felt in that first instance that they had misheard, because they go to Pharaoh and they basically to say what God had told them to say. And Pharaoh went, no way, I'm not letting the people go. And they went, why is this not working? Must have felt like one of those sat-nav fail moments. They'd misheard, they'd gone the wrong way. But God, he was just getting started. So if we look in Exodus, we're now kind of up to about Exodus 7, and we see the various plagues that God sent on the people. The plague of blood, where the rivers all turned to blood. The plague of frogs absolutely everywhere. The plague of gnats, can you imagine how horrible that would have been? Followed by the plague of flies. Then the plague on livestock, where all the livestock died. And then boils, hideous. Then hail, big hail stones. Then locusts, the plague of darkness, and then finally the plague on the firstborn, where the firstborn of every family died. And eventually Pharaoh and the Egyptians had had enough. They essentially begged the people to go. So that night they gathered up all their stuff, the Israelites gathered up all their stuff, and they fled. Now when you see the pictures of this story in at Sunday school, you see a nice kind of easily managed crowd with Moses at the front with his stick, and then they're all trotting along behind, maybe a few sheep and stuff, but largely a relatively simple, easily managed crowd. That was not what this was like. In Exodus 12, it tells us that there were 600,000 men who left that day. Exodus 12, verse 37. The Israelites journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, and there were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. So that's 600,000 men, plus the women, plus the children, plus some cows and sheep, plus a few Egyptians that escaped along with them. So we're probably talking about well over 2 million people, roughly the population of the whole of Birmingham. Okay. All of the tribes left Israel. But imagine how difficult that would be. Imagine how big that crowd is. The back of the crowd can't see the middle of the crowd, let alone the front of the crowd. How on earth are they going to find their way where they're supposed to go? How are they going to keep a handle on all of these people? When the four of us go shopping, it's hard enough to keep track of each other. So how on earth are they going to do that? This is where the second sat-nav moment happens. Exodus 13, verse 21 to 22. By day, the Lord went ahead of them in a pillar of cloud to guide them on their way, and by night in a pillar of fire to give them light, so that they could travel by day or night. How amazing would that be? Even if you're stuck right at the back of the crowd, you can see at the front that pillar of cloud during the day, guiding the way. And then at night, it turns to a pillar of fire. What protection that would have given them. But it was more than that. It was more than just a sat-nav. It was the presence of God. They were not without the presence of God throughout their whole journey. And we see that when Pharaoh changed his mind and realised what he'd done by letting the Israelites go, he set off in pursuit of them. And God led them in a slightly roundabout sort of way to the Red Sea. And at the time, I suspect the people thought this was another sat-nav fail, in that they're now faced with the Egyptians coming up behind them and the sea in front of them. And you sort of think, oh, this isn't going to work. But God had a path in mind, a path they couldn't see. He was going to take them right through the middle of the sea on dry land. If we get to Exodus 14, verse 19 to 20, we see what God does. It says, Then the angel of the Lord, who had been travelling in front of Israel's army, withdrew and went behind them. The pillar of cloud also moved from in front and stood behind them, coming between the armies of Egypt and Israel. Throughout the night the cloud brought darkness to one side and light to the other side, so that neither went near the other all night long. God put that pillar of cloud right behind them. The Egyptians couldn't see where they were going. God's presence was right in that pillar. He stood between the Israelites and the Egyptians. He then played havoc with the chariot wheels, and the Egyptians realised that God was actually fighting for his people and against them. Once they were in the middle of the sea, God closed the waters, and that was the end of them. That's the kind of God I want on my side. That's the kind of God I want guiding me. So how does this impact us? Well, the first point is that we need a guide. Now, we might not think we need a guide. It's easy to think we know where we're going, but we're like the Israelites. We can't see the front of the crowd from where we are. We can't see the whole picture. If we have a look at Exodus 13, verse 17 and 18, we'll see that God didn't actually lead them on the most direct route. So when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them out on the road through the Philistine country, though that was shorter. For God said if they face war, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people around by the desert road towards the Red Sea. If they'd had a map, and if that had been me, I'd have looked at where I was and where I needed to go, and I would have plotted the straightest route from A to B. But God saw a bigger picture than that. God saw that if they encountered the Philistine armies, they would have freaked out and probably gone running back to Egypt, and the whole mission would have been a waste of time. We need God's guidance. In Psalms it says, I will instruct you and teach you in the way you should go. I will counsel you and watch over you. God promises that he will guide us. When we were children, we needed our parents to teach us things. We needed our parents to teach us what we needed to do. And in life, we have to make lots of decisions. We face decisions about our careers, our relationships, where we need to stay, the church we need to attend. Some of those are massive decisions, some are much smaller. But we need God's guidance to make those decisions daily. By walking closely with God, he is that light for us. He's that guiding light. We think we know where we're going, but we need to understand that we don't see the whole picture. The decisions we make today will impact things that happen to us in months, years ahead. And it's only sometimes when you look back and you see the impact of your decisions and you can see God's guiding hand on your life that you think, that's why I needed to make that decision. That's why God led me in that direction. The second point is that God is willing to guide us. He wants to guide us. He wants to have that relationship with us. The Israelites didn't need to ask. God just provided direction. They didn't sit down and say, right, okay, God, we need you to guide us from A to B. God just was there. God was there guiding them. They didn't have a route planned out. They just left. But God stepped in and he led the way. God guides us when we're prepared to do his will rather than insisting that our way is the right way. He guides the humble, it says in Psalms. This isn't just something that's consigned to the pages of history. God is guiding us today. We're coming up to Christmas, and it's when we remember the birth of Jesus. Jesus is the light that guides us. The most obvious guiding light for us that we have today is, how did Jesus live? Because if what we're deciding to do contradicts that kind of lifestyle, then we need to think, is that the right thing to do? Back when I was in youth group, we all used to wear these wristbands, WWJD, what would Jesus do? And that still stands. I haven't got the wristband anymore, but it does still stand. That, I need to measure my life against how Jesus lived his life. The third point is that we need to trust the guide. So in all the confusion and panic, can you imagine how confusing that must have been? Well, not all of the people would have known what was going on. It would have been hearsay and speculation. And it's like, come on, pack up all your stuff, we've got to go. They just had to trust in God. They had to trust that God was leading them the right way. Even when the directions might have seemed a bit wacky. It would have been so easy at that point to second guess or challenge the route that God was taking them on. If they had, then they would have ended up in a very different situation. First with the Philistines and then with the Egyptians. But going back a stage, what would have happened if Moses had ignored the guidance he received from God in the burning bush? Would the Israelites have left at all? Those decisions that are made, that trust that you place in the guide, has huge impacts. I read a really interesting article called Let God Do the Driving. And imagine that you are in a car, you and a passenger in a car. And we probably won't comment on which one of you is doing the driving, just in case. Now imagine the passenger is trying to control the wheel. And what impact does that have on the stress levels in the car? If we let God do the driving, there are things that happen in our lives, good things that happen in our lives. It gives us peace. Imagine that you're trying to boss somebody around while you're attempting to trust them at the same time. Those two things can't happen simultaneously. Trying to be in control and relinquish control at the same time just doesn't work. But if we place our trust in God, then we can rest, we can stop striving, and we can live in peace. We can have rest. I know so many people at the moment that are just exhausted, and we just need rest. So if you're a passenger in a car, you're going to have a much more restful journey than if you're fighting for control. You can sit, you can look out of the window, you can read a book, you could listen to some music, because you're not trying to fight for control the whole time. There are lots of things I'm not designed to do. I'm not designed to breathe underwater. I'm not designed to read complicated mathematical textbooks. I'm not designed to run marathons. Because I'm not designed to do those things, trying to do them would make me exhausted, stressed, and probably a little grumpy. And in the same way, if we try and take control away from God because we don't trust Him, we're going to end up feeling spiritually and emotionally drained and exhausted. We are not designed to make all those decisions for ourselves. We're not designed to have that constant battle. God wants to do that for us. By letting God take control of those things, we can then relax and be contented in the role that He has designed us to do, whatever that might be for us. What about communication? Imagine those two people in the car again. The passenger trying to take control of the wheel. What's the conversation in the car at that point? It's probably not very pleasant. It's probably quite stressful. If we're constantly trying to wrestle control away from God, we're not going to have that correct, proper level of communication. The communication between us and God won't be easy. It will be difficult, it will be tense, it will be stressed, because we think He should be driving us somewhere else. Through our journey, we find that our confidence in God is always coupled with our trust in God. So the more we trust Him, the more we are able to love Him. So guidance is much more than a one-off instruction. Have you ever been in a journey in a car where you've got the sat-nav on and you pull onto a road, probably a motorway, and it says, continue straight ahead for 120 miles. And then it goes quiet. And you hear nothing from your sat-nav for probably about 118 miles, where it pops up with another instruction and off you go again. It can be quite disconcerting, but it is reassuring that the sat-nav is there and still keeping a track of how far down that 120 miles you've got, and it will spring back into life again when you need to make another decision, when you need to make another turn. The same happened in the story with the Israelites, and God spoke to them from within the cloud. This cloud didn't leave them the whole time that they were on their huge, massive journey. God still spoke to them. He gave them instructions. So in Numbers 12, verse 5 to 6, we read, Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, and He stood at the entrance of the tent and summoned Aaron and Miriam. When the two of them stepped forward, He said, Listen to my words. When there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, reveal myself to them in visions. I speak to them in dreams. And in Deuteronomy, it says, Then the Lord appeared at the tent in a pillar of cloud, and the cloud stood over the entrance to the tent. And in Psalms, it says, Moses and Aaron were among His priests. Samuel was among those who called on His name. They called on the Lord, and He answered them. He spoke to them from the pillar of cloud. They kept His statutes and the decrees He gave them. So today we don't have God speaking to us from pillars of cloud or burning bushes, although sometimes when you're making tricky decisions, that would kind of be useful. but possibly a little terrifying. But He's not abandoned us to wander lost. God speaks to us today in so many ways. He speaks to us through prayer, through reading the Bible, through the examples of Jesus, through the examples and the counsel of other Christians. So what are the results of good guidance? If we follow God's way, what does that mean? Well, for the Israelites, it means they ended up in the promised land eventually. They had many adventures along the way, but God provided everything they needed throughout that whole journey. Water from rocks, food from the sky. Read the story, it's incredible. But there must have been times when they wondered what on earth was going on. And there were definitely times when they moaned and complained about the situations they were in. So 2020, what a year. It's been a year to remember for so many horrible and difficult reasons. But one thing it has taught us is how to trust God for guidance when we can't see the way forward. At times this year, it's kind of felt like we're at the back of that crowd of Israelites where we kind of know we're heading somewhere, but we can't see the front and we don't know quite where that somewhere is. We haven't got a map and we've got absolutely no clue where we're supposed to be going. So what do we do in a situation like that? Well, we could just sit down and not go anywhere and just go, oh, I can't cope, I'm not doing anything. And don't get me wrong, rest is important. God wants to give us restorative rest. And at times He does just say, just stop, just sit, just recuperate, and then you'll be ready to move on again. But the key thing is that that rest is getting us ready to move on again, not just to sit and give up completely. Well, we could go our own way. We could make up our own route. And probably we'll start off in the right direction. We'll probably start off in the direction God wants us to go. But if we don't keep checking back with the map, then we could very easily go off course and we could very easily be a long way from where we're supposed to be in a very short space of time. So obviously the best answer is to follow God's leading. And I will remember 2020 for many things, but one of the things I'll remember it for is having to ask God for His guidance on a much more regular basis than I perhaps have done in the past. Things have changed from day to day. Things have changed almost from hour to hour sometimes. Planning ahead in our own strength has been impossible. This is the time where we've had to seek the rest, the peace and the contentment from allowing God to drive. So in this world that we're in right now, in this world that seems quite dark and difficult, what can we take from this? We can take from this that God is that light. God is the light shining in the darkness. That sounds a bit Christian and cliche, but He wants to guide us. We can take comfort from this story where God led His people the way He needed them to go. He led them to something better. He led them through danger. He led them through battles. He led them through incredibly difficult situations, and He never, ever left them. And the same applies to us today. We're facing this dark world. We're facing all these difficult situations. And God is that light. God, through Jesus, sent us that light. He sent us that example lifestyle. We can look to Jesus. We can look in the Bible. We can speak to God. That relationship is restored, and He can guide us through. He can help us make the big decisions. He can help us make the little decisions.